Exactly a year ago at the G20 summit, US President Joe Biden and Indian PM Narendra Modi launched the India-U.S. Renewable Energy Technologies Action Platform. That marked a new chapter in the two countries' bilateral energy cooperation. Now, the platform's focus is on joint research, technology, policy collaborations, and skill development in renewable tech. That is, of course, one of the many milestones in the US-India energy partnership, which started way back in 2009 with the Partnership to Advance Clean Energy or PACE program. Along the way, of course, there have been several collaborations and investments, such as a $3.8 billion funding from the US International Development Finance Corporation to meet India's renewable energy and infrastructure goals. So how will the two countries take this partnership forward? Also, what about US's own initiatives, like the $7.3 billion investment under the Inflation Reduction Act's Empowering Rural America program? Can there be parallels or lessons in India, where rural electrification, of course, still remains a challenge? To discuss all this and more, my colleague and ET's in-house energy expert Sanjeev Choudhary caught up with the United States Deputy Secretary of Energy, David Turk. Listen in to this very interesting chat. It's Thursday, the 12th of September. From the Economic Times, I'm Anirban Choudhary. This is the Morning Brief.
Mr. David Turk, thank you so much for joining the Morning Brief.
Well, thank you, Sanjeev. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for your time.
What brings you to India?
Well, I've been to India a bunch of times over the years. I've worked on clean energy issues from the U.S. government, but also from a multilateral organization, the International Energy Agency. And put simply, there's a lot of exciting things going on clean energy. We're certainly doing a lot under the Biden-Harris administration in the U.S. side. And there's a lot going on in India. So we've had cooperation bilaterally for many, many years. And the visit here is really to strengthen that collaboration.
So is there any specific agenda in this visit?
So we're talking about a lot of different issues. We have a strong foundation of collaboration, everything from clean hydrogen to energy storage to offshore wind. You name it, we've collaborated on it bilaterally in one way or another. But one of the big focus areas, and we've had really very constructive conversations, is on supply chains, clean energy supply chains, and making sure that both in the U.S., but in India as well, as we deploy ourselves more and more clean energy in other countries around the world, we actually get the economic benefits of that. We get the supply chain benefits of that from solar PV, from battery, from electrolyzers. And so we're spending a lot of time talking to a variety of ministries here in India, the Prime Minister's office, but a lot of private sector players and think tanks about how we can strengthen our collaboration on clean energy supply chains for the jobs piece of it, for the economic impact of it, but also for our own national security and economic security of our two countries. There's a lot of alignment between our two countries on this issue.
So US and India have had energy partnership for some time now. And recently, recent years, it became a strategic partnership. And then the entire spectrum of energy is covered. So would you like to highlight one or two areas where we have been able to make some substantial progress?
Yeah, happy to do it. And it has been a long-standing partnership, but we've just been raising it up significantly, including over the last few years, certainly in the Biden-Harris administration. You mentioned the strategic partnership. It's a strategic clean energy partnership that Prime Minister Modi and President Biden agreed on. It's our Department of Energy and the U.S. side that's executing on a lot of that. And it's with a variety of ministries. It's with the Ministry of Power. It's the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy. It's the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas with Niti Aayog. So we're making a lot of discussions with all the key ministers and secretaries and their staffs as well. But to give you a few examples of areas, clean hydrogen is an area that's a priority for our government, our country, and a priority for the Indian government and Indian private sector and society more generally. We're spending a lot of money in the U.S. We've got $7 billion, for example, deploying hydrogen hubs across our country. We've got one of the most generous tax credits for clean hydrogen production. India has significant amounts of funding that they're spending. So what we're doing is comparing notes about what success we're seeing, what challenges we're seeing, But going beyond just having expert discussions, we actually set up a private sector-led hydrogen task force so that we can have not only public government-to-government conversations, but very much involved with the private sector, because it's the private sector that's actually going to take clean hydrogen and take it to scale in a variety of applications in our country, in the U.S., but in India, and looking for those opportunities between our two countries and other partners and allies as well. So that's one example of an area where we've got strong collaboration, but it's expanding even further. And then energy storage is another big one. This is a big part of how you integrate all those renewables, solar in India, but solar in the U.S., and wind and offshore wind increasingly in the U.S. And offshore wind is another area of collaboration that we have with India. But to make all of those new renewables work, in addition to having smart grids and having transmission and all of that, storage is such a key part of the equation. And we're seeing a lot of storage build out in our country, and starting to see it in India in significant ways that make everything more efficient and make it all work.
So earlier this year, there was a big investment, about $500 million or so, in the first solar project in southern India. So that kind of funding, do you think more funding would come here? And would it be open to investing in projects developed by Indian private sector players?
Well, absolutely. And so that was a big part of our conversation, right? If you're going to do things at scale, and we need to do things at scale, you need to have the financing piece of it. And we do have some financing tools that we can bring to the table. The one deal you mentioned with First Solar, that was our Development Finance Corporation. DFC is the acronym for those who follow these things. That was a big deal, but it's only one deal, and we hope that there are more deals to come along those lines, whether bilaterally in terms of the Development Finance Corporation, but also thinking of the World Bank and thinking of multilateral levers and tools as well. And so if you're going to do things at scale, you need to have the financing, and that's absolutely part of the conversation we're having, including to help finance the clean energy supply and diversifying that supply. Again, it's good for jobs. It's also good for economic security. Right now, we all rely too much on a single country for a lot of our clean energy supply. We should have those jobs. We should have those economic activities in India and in the U.S. as well. But diversification of supply chains helps also.
IRA, which is a great legislation, which has triggered a lot of corporate investment announcements also. Do you think that will help America kind of reach somewhere closer to where China is today in terms of the kind of hold they have on the entire supply chain of new energy and EVs?
So I don't think you can overstate how big a deal the Inflation Reduction Act has been in the U.S. context, but it has significant ripples internationally as well. What it means is we can walk the talk in the United States and reduce our own emissions. So before the IRA was passed, before Biden and Harris came into office 3.5 years ago, we were on course in our country to have about a 20% emissions reductions, greenhouse gas emission reductions to 2030 off a 2005 baseline. The IRA and some other pieces of legislation meant that we're now on a trajectory to at least a 40% reduction in our own emissions, just to give you a sense of scale of what the IRA means. But what it means also is it allows us to have a lot more domestic supply chain, domestic investment, so we don't just import everything. So it's been remarkable to see how much new private sector investment in the U.S. has been spurred by the IRA tax credits, by some grant funding, by our loan program, to the tune of just in the battery supply chain, over $200 billion of private sector investment that's been spurred by this intentional strategic government investment. And we're seeing that in solar PV, we're seeing that in electrolyzers, we're seeing that in wind, we're seeing that across the board in all parts of our country. So it's been a big deal reducing our emissions, but it's also been a big deal in terms of having that job and economic activity. And what we're here talking with our Indian colleagues about is how what we're doing with the IRA, including a lot of investment by Indian companies in the U.S. taking advantage of those tax incentives. It is, yeah, there's quite a few significant examples, which are great. Like, we love to have Indian companies investing in our country, as India is pleased to have U.S. investment in India. But what we're seeing is how we're doing things with the IRA and our other tools is very complementary to what India is doing, spurring its own supply chain, spurring its own jobs and economic activity on the clean energy side. And so we're looking for ways to explore that.
So where will we be by the end of the decade in terms of, because the whole ambition of IRA is to not just bring back jobs, but have that kind of superiority of Americans in the supply chain of new energy, right? Which China currently has. Where will we be? Like, say, how would US compare with China by the end of the decade in this?
I'm very optimistic, eyes wide open, right? China has a lot of, they have built overcapacity in solar PV. They've made a lot of investments in a variety of different clean energy technologies. But I think what separates and what makes me very confident about both the US and India is we have phenomenal innovation culture. We have phenomenal national labs. The Department of Energy in our country administers those 17 national labs across our country. We've got obviously academic institutions, as does India as well. But it's that private sector entrepreneurial culture, that innovation culture that's not just thinking of making marginal improvements in solar PV or batteries or other technologies, but big step changes, including different chemistries for batteries, including electrolyzers that are that much more efficient going forward.
So America is going to polls. You will soon elect a new president. Do you think the outcome of the elections will affect in any way the pace of transition in US?
So there's no doubt leadership matters. And I think we've seen that with President Biden and Vice President Harris's leadership in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, in terms of the other pieces of legislation. That makes a big difference in administration. And every indication, I've done a few events with Vice President Harris. She is a clean energy champion. She will carry forward and expand our efforts even forward if she's elected. I feel very confident about that. But what I think we've seen is the Inflation Reduction Act in particular, a lot of those tax incentives, grants, other kinds of tools are really embedded in our society. So I think there's a durability in terms of the tax incentives in particular, but a lot of the other things that are going to make a lot of tailwind going forward. But leadership does matter. There's no doubt about it.
So you think the IRA will kind of act as a shield against any Republican design of reversal of clean goals?
I would put it this way. There's so many benefits from the clean energy economy, all the battery manufacturing facilities, all the solar PV manufacturing facilities. When I've met with politicians, mayors, senators, representatives, they love new factories opening up. They love new manufacturing facilities opening up. They love that economic activity in their states and districts, and they're not going to want to go against that, whether it's clean energy or otherwise. And the genius of the Inflation Reduction Act is it just spurs that at a scale we've never seen in our country with communities all across the country.
So in an election year, no administration really would want oil prices to rise. What are the kind of risks you see for the oil market?
Yeah, so we spend a lot of time on this, and I think there's a lot of shared interests. I know, having conferred a lot with the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas over the years, the minister and the secretary and other staff there, oil prices make a big difference in terms of our economy, our U.S. economy, the Indian economy. We saw that when oil prices spiked coming out of COVID, right? COVID had a supply-demand mismatch, and then you had Russia invading Ukraine, which threw oil markets into a turmoil. That had a real consequence. Price at the pump went up in the U.S., and it had a big impact here in India as well. So there's a lot of shared interest between our two countries to work together to have stable oil prices, to have stable oil supplies, and a lot of that's worked.
So do you expect prices to remain stable for the remainder of the year?
So we've seen prices go down over the last several week period of time, and it's a global market. It's complicated. It depends on supply, demand. It depends on what China's economy is doing, as well as India's economy, our economy going forward. We've seen prices go down over the last several week period of time, and we're going to do everything we possibly can on behalf of American citizens, but folks around the world to have stable prices.
One tool which the US government deployed or the developed countries deployed was sanctions against Russia when Russia invaded Ukraine. That brought in a lot of uncertainties. Prices went up rapidly. They came down also after a few months or so. One step in it was that you imposed a price cap. To me, it seems that price cap was ineffective because India or China, who've been taking oil from Russia, they have been able to do it. And the Russian oil has been selling above price cap mostly. But since the time price cap imposed, mostly Russian oil has sold above the price cap. So what was the point in imposing a price cap?
I would disagree with you about the price cap in terms of the effectiveness of it. The price cap, I think, has worked. And what we are trying to do with the price cap, and we keep recalibrating and making sure that we are rightfully so, having new sanctions on Russia, right? A country should not benefit from a spike in oil prices because it invades another country, right? Like that is just both fairness and from a geopolitical perspective as well. So what we've tried to do with the price cap is make sure that Russia can't get the full benefit from the oil that it does sell globally. And so the price cap tries to not only directly but indirectly help leverage by India, help leverage by other countries, even if they're not formally participating in the price cap, to have more leverage to get more of a discount in terms of the oil that is sold from Russia, whether to India or other countries as well. And what we've seen is that price cap has kept that delta significantly more. What we haven't wanted to do is restrict and further spike up oil prices in ways that aren't helpful for India, aren't helpful for the U.S., aren't helpful for the global economy as well. So the price cap very deliberately is to try to increase that delta, to try to avoid as much revenue as possible going to Russia from its illegal invasion, barbaric invasion of the Ukraine, and at the same time have enough oil supply so that we can have the affordability, the economic activity. And I think if you think of those two core objectives, fundamental objectives, it's actually been quite successful.
One supplementary question on the sanctions as a tool, as a foreign policy tool. I'm talking only with respect to energy supplies. So like it was imposed on Iran, it has been imposed on Venezuela. What it does is that it induces a lot of uncertainty, it curtails supplies. So for a heavy importer like us, it becomes a problem because it reduces the sources of supply from which we can tap, right? So Iran was shut. So suddenly we were not able to source 10% of our supplies. So do you think it is a very effective tool and it is a good tool given the kind of advantage and disadvantage both it creates in the system?
Yeah, so take the Russia example again. When you have such a barbaric, illegal invasion, and think of the human toll that's happened in Ukraine, when those kinds of things happen, you look for whatever tools you've got in order to try to blunt that impact, to send strong messages, to make sure that, again, Russia doesn't benefit because of a price spike because they're an exporter of oil. They shouldn't get more money because they've invaded another country.
So one last thing on U.S. oil production, because that's been a crucial thing. It's been rising despite OPEC holding back a lot of supplies. The great rise which we have seen in production in U.S., Canada, and Guyana, I mean, that has all helped to calm market, stabilize market. But this kind of rise which we are seeing in U.S., does that in some way be counterproductive in the sense that it will affect your clean energy goals or climate goals?
So President Biden, Vice President Harris, our department, all of us in this administration have made very clear about our responsibility to step up to the climate crisis. All right, we are a big emitter. We're a big per capita emitter. Our target for 2030 is over 50% reductions, and I'm confident that we're going to get there. So we need to walk the walk and do what we need to do to be on track. And I've spent a lot of my career on clean energy and climate and feel very strongly that this is a historic responsibility that all leaders around the world and all of us in public office need to step up for. We need to have affordable energy. We need to have stable energy prices, including the energy that's used by not only folks in the U.S., but folks in India, folks around the world. And we need to take care of those who are most vulnerable to those price shocks. So we need to transition, but we need to have affordable energy in the near term as well. And I think there's a way you can do both of those and still be very, very aggressive, still be very, very ambitious in terms of the new technologies, the clean energy technologies, and the emission reductions that we're seeing.
Thank you, Mr. Turk, so much for giving us time and having this candid conversation with us.
Thanks, Sanjeev. Thank you for the time, and happy to do it anytime.
That's it for today. You were listening to this conversation on The Morning Brief. It was sound designed by Amrit Reggie and edited by me. The Morning Brief drops every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday on a listening platform of your choice. This is your host, Anirban Choudhary, signing off. Have a good week.